I didn't hear the front door open when I came back. Must have been the carpet, or maybe I was too focused on the grocery bags cutting into my fingers. The house smelled faintly of her perfume and the faintest trace of wine, but it was the sound of her voice that made me freeze. I was halfway to the kitchen when I heard her in the living room, phone pressed to her ear, laughing in that smug, drawn-out way she always did when she was talking to her mother about serious things. "Don't worry, I'll drain him dry," she said, her tone dripping with satisfaction, like she'd just ordered dessert before the check even arrived. There was a pause, and then her mother's chuckle, warm and approving, came faintly through the air. "Good girl. No point in letting him walk away with anything worth having." I stopped dead, the plastic bags biting into my palms. One of the handles snapped, a carton of milk thudding onto the carpet. Neither of them hurt. I stepped quietly backward into the hallway, into that blind corner where I knew the reflection from the TV couldn't catch me. My heart was thudding, but not with panic. It was something slower, heavier, settling in like cold steel in the gut. My first thought wasn't denial. It wasn't even hurt. It was interesting. Interesting that she was so confident, so absolutely certain she was playing me like a cheap slot machine. I eased the bags onto the floor, making sure not to rustle the paper too much, and let myself listen a little longer. She spoke about me as if I were already a ghost, some defeated figure they could pick over. "He'll probably whine about the money, but I've got it covered," she said. "By the time he figures out what's happening, it'll all be done. He won't even have a chair left to sit on." Her mother hummed, like she was approving a well-laid recipe. "Best to get it all at once, dear. Don't give him time to think." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I straightened, grabbed the bags again, and walked toward the kitchen, making a little more noise than before so she'd know I'd just come in. She turned her head as I passed the living room, giving me a casual, empty smile before lowering her voice into the phone. That night, she made a little show of it. We were at the dining table, her in her silk robe, glass of red wine in hand, the divorce papers laid neatly in front of her like a centerpiece. She slid them toward me with the confidence of a woman certain she'd already won. "I think this will be easiest for both of us," she said lightly, almost rehearsed. "Sign, and we can move on. No drama." I looked down at the papers, then up at her. She was expecting a fight, maybe anger, some desperate attempt to negotiate. But I just picked up the pen, signed where she'd marked, and pushed them back across the table. "That's it?" she asked, eyebrow lifting in surprise. "That's it," I said, my voice steady, almost bored. She smirked, leaning back. "At least you're smart enough not to drag this out." I gave her a small, almost polite smile in return, then excused myself to take the groceries upstairs. I left the wine and the papers behind, like they were nothing more than recycling. Inside, my mind was already clicking into place, not with grief or confusion, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had just been handed their opponent's playbook. She thought she had the upper hand. She thought she was going to drain me dry. She didn't know that the well she was planning to empty didn't even connect to my water, and she didn't know that I had just enough patience to let her believe otherwise. She came into the kitchen the next morning with a bounce in her step, hair still damp from the shower, that little smirk curling at the corner of her mouth. She thought she was going to be dealing with a broken man, someone pacing the floor, half-shaven, demanding explanations. Instead, I was sitting at the table, fully dressed for work, sipping coffee and scrolling through the news. She placed the signed agreement in front of me like it was a victory banner. "We can file this today," she said. "No point in letting it drag on." I set my coffee down, leaned back in my chair, and gave her a slow nod. "Sure, let's make it easy." That flicker in her eyes, half suspicion, half delight, told me she was recalibrating. She'd been prepared for resistance, maybe even for a legal fight. Instead, I was handing her the script she wanted, reading my lines without hesitation. "House is yours," I said, almost casually. "Car too. And we'll split the savings, though, honestly, you can keep the joint account. I don't need it." For a moment she just stared, like a cat that had pounced on something too quickly and wasn't sure it was real prey. Then she smiled, slow and satisfied. "At least you're smart enough not to drag this out." I smiled back, but mine was different, smaller, quieter, the kind of smile you give when someone just told you the punchline of a joke you already knew. I didn't mention the other account. I didn't mention the assets with my family name on them. I didn't mention that every dollar she thought she was bleeding from me was from the shallowest, most irrelevant pool I had. There's a difference between losing and discarding. She thought she'd stripped me bare. In truth, I was handing her scraps. We drove together to the notary later that day. On the way, she talked about how she'd redecorate the house. Something more modern, you know? A clean slate. I nodded like a man too tired to care. Inside, I was picturing the deeds, the trust documents, the language my father had insisted on when setting them up. Non-transferable. Beneficiary claims terminate upon marital separation. She'd never set foot in the trust office. She didn't even know it existed. The house, the car, the accounts she was so excited about. Those were crumbs. My real assets were behind a wall she didn't even know she was standing in front of. When we filed the paperwork, she practically skipped out of the office, her hand light on my arm. To the clerk, it probably looked like we were just a friendly couple parting ways. She didn't notice the way I glanced at the clock, counting down in my head. Every smile she gave me was fuel. Every self-satisfied look was proof she thought the game was already over. I let her keep thinking that. Because the easiest way to win against someone who's certain of victory is to let them run right off the cliff while they're still waving to the crowd. The day after we filed, she told her friends, loudly enough for me to hear from the hallway, that I'd be slumming it in some cramped little apartment near the industrial park. I didn't correct her. Let her imagine me wrestling with roaches and flickering light bulbs while she paraded through her house. Instead of turning toward the freeway that would have led to the part of town she pictured, I drove downtown. The skyline shimmered in the early light, glass and steel catching the sun like polished blades. I parked beneath a high-rise whose name, carved into the stone above the doors, had been mine long before it was hers to even pronounce. Caraway. My father's building. His legacy. The marble lobby was quiet, the air cool and faintly scented with lemon polish. The receptionist didn't need my name. She stood as soon as I stepped in, her voice warm but respectful. "Good morning, Mr. Caraway. The attorney is expecting you." Upstairs, the trust's office is stretched wide and deliberate, the kind of space that made you feel small if you didn't belong there. For me, it felt like walking into a locked room I'd carried the key to all my life. The attorney, silver hair, sharp eyes, rose from his desk with a smile that carried both sympathy and approval. "I understand you're ready to proceed," he said. I took the leather chair opposite him, resting my hands on the polished wood. "Activate the inheritance transfer." My voice was even, without ceremony. His eyes glinted, and for a moment he allowed himself a small, almost conspiratorial smile. "She's going to be shocked." I didn't return the smile, not because I disagreed, but because this wasn't about gloating, not yet. This was about precision. My father hadn't trusted luck or emotion. He'd trusted structures, clauses, airtight locks. I was simply turning the key. The paperwork was already prepared, my name printed cleanly on every page. The trust had been dormant, waiting for a specific trigger. My father's condition that no funds could be accessed while I was legally married. A clause he'd added after watching one too many men in our family lose everything to romantic entanglements. I signed each page carefully, not rushing. Each pen stroke a quiet act of reclamation. No dramatic flourish, just ink on paper. When the last signature was done, the attorney placed a heavy envelope before me. Documents confirming my sole beneficiary status, effective immediately. "This," he said, tapping the folder, "is untouchable. Separate entity, separate accounts, separate holdings." She could spend the rest of her life in court and never touch a dime. I slipped the envelope into my briefcase, the weight of it more symbolic than physical. This wasn't just money. It was every hour my father had worked, every calculated risk he'd taken, every principle he'd drilled into me about foresight and control. While she was sipping lattes and browsing furniture catalogs, imagining my downsize, I was sitting in the heart of a fortress she didn't even know existed. Every brick of it had been built long before she'd ever stepped into my life, and every brick was now mine alone. When I left the building, the sun was higher, the streets busier. I walked past a cafe and caught sight of a couple laughing over breakfast. She and I used to look like that, before I realized that in her eyes, I'd always been a mark, not a partner. I got into my car, adjusted the mirror, and drove toward my temporary place. Not an apartment, not some crumbling shoebox, just a quiet loft with a view of the river, leased under the trust's name. Somewhere she'd never think to look, because in her mind, my world was already small. She didn't know that in reality, It had just expanded beyond her reach forever. She chose the restaurant, naturally. Some trendy spot downtown with moody lighting and menus printed on recycled paper that looked like they'd been rescued from a shipwreck. I showed up early and took a seat where I could see the door. She arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a fitted dress that said she wanted to be noticed. Gold jewelry, perfectly applied lipstick, hair with that deliberate, I just rolled out of a salon volume. She smiled like the winner in a photo finish. Thought we should celebrate being civilized, she said as she sat down, sliding her phone onto the table face up so she could see the screen light up. A performance. She was already expecting congratulatory texts from friends who thought she'd pulled off the divorce of the decade. I was in a plain button-down, sleeves rolled once. No tie. No watch worth remarking on. I looked like a man in transition, which is exactly what I wanted her to see. The server brought water, menus, a smile that lingered on her just long enough for her to bask in it. She ordered an expensive cocktail without glancing at the price. I stuck with whiskey, neat. This won't take long, she said after a sip. Just a few details to finalize. Once we get the settlement checks sorted, we can file with the court. I'm glad we're avoiding the drama. You're handling this like a grown-up. I nodded, cutting into my steak. You always said I needed to learn. She smirked, spearing a piece of fish. Well, you'll survive. You've got your little paycheck, and maybe you'll find someone who appreciates that. There was the jab. The casual cruelty dressed up as banter. She wanted to see a crack in me. Resentment, embarrassment, anything to prove she still had the power to sting. I didn't give it to her. I just chewed, swallowed, and said, maybe. She leaned back, watching me over the rim of her glass, searching for something that wasn't there. I let her talk, about redecorating the house, taking a trip to clear her head, maybe trading in the car for something sportier. Every word was confirmation. She believed the assets she was walking away with were the sum of my worth. She didn't realize she'd been given the leftovers. When the check came, I reached for it without hesitation. Paid in cash. Added a generous tip that made the server's eyes light up. She noticed, of course she noticed, but couldn't reconcile it. Why was a man she thought was broke leaving that kind of tip? As we stood to leave, I shook her hand lightly instead of leaning in for the cheek kiss she'd clearly expected. Good luck, I said, not sarcastically, but with a quiet finality that made her brow crease for just a second. On the sidewalk outside, she hesitated before walking toward her car. She almost asked something. I saw it in the way her lips parted, the faint turn of her head, but decided against it. She was too invested in the story she'd been telling herself, that she had won. I watched her drive away, taillights disappearing into the night traffic, and headed in the opposite direction. My hands were steady, my mind already elsewhere. She thought dinner was about wrapping up loose ends. I knew it was just another scene in a play she didn't realize I'd already rewritten. The morning broke with that cool stillness that comes before the world decides whether it's going to be kind or cruel. I'd just finished buttering toast, the kettle still hissing faintly on the stove, when my phone buzzed on the counter. Not a number I recognized, but I didn't need to answer to know which side of the chessboard the call had come from. I ignored it. Across town, she was likely still in bed when her lawyer called. He didn't mince words, told her to get to his office immediately. No, it couldn't wait. No, he wouldn't explain over the phone. That alone would have rattled her, because she'd chosen him for his reassuring style. If he was rattled, something was wrong. I could picture her rushing, throwing on a dress, sliding into heels, hair pinned back just enough to suggest control even when she didn't feel it. She'd have driven a little too fast, parked too close to the curb, walked into that paneled office expecting to discuss signatures and closing dates. Instead, the moment she stepped in, there it was, a thick cream-colored envelope sitting squarely in the center of his desk. Official letterhead. My family name embossed at the top. What's this? She would have asked, trying for casual. He didn't smile. He just gestured for her to sit. She stayed standing. Read it, he said, sliding it toward her. Inside was a formal notice from the Caraway Family Trust, issued by our attorney. It detailed, line by line, the activation of an inheritance transfer in my name alone. Holdings, accounts, property shares, investment portfolios, all totaling over $15 million. Effective immediately. The ink on the signatures was barely dry, and next to the section marked beneficiaries, her name was conspicuously absent. No spouse. No mention. Nothing. Her lawyer watched her eyes move across the page, saw the tightening of her jaw, the way her breathing changed halfway down the list. She reached the bottom, read the effective date, and froze. That date was the day after we filed. Finally, he leaned back, exhaled, and said, "Actually, you might want to sit down." I imagined her gripping the edge of the page a little too hard, nails biting into the paper. "This can't be right," she'd insist, maybe with a small, brittle laugh. "He can't just." "He can." The lawyer would interrupt, his tone careful but firm. "These assets were inaccessible during your marriage. They became his sole property the moment the separation was filed. Legally, you have no claim." Her pulse must have been pounding in her ears. She'd have tried to summon that sharp, condescending tone she used when cornered, but there's no performance when the audience knows the lines better than you do. She was no longer dealing with a husband she thought she could play. She was up against the letter of the law, carved in clauses decades before she even knew my name. Meanwhile, I sat at my kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, reading the paper. I knew the exact moment she learned because my phone lit up again, her name this time, pulsing across the screen. I let it ring. Then another call. And another. I imagined her sitting there, staring at the number, wondering if she could bluff her way out of this the way she had with everything else. But even she would have recognized the shape of the wall she'd just hit. It wasn't moving, and there was no door. By the time she left his office, I knew her hands would be trembling. Not from fear, not exactly, but from the first real glimpse of something she couldn't control, manipulate, or charm her way into. For someone who'd been so certain she was holding all the cards, the realization must have landed like a stone in deep water. I finished my toast. The day outside looked brighter than it had in weeks. She didn't knock. The front door rattled against the frame as she shoved it open, her heels striking the hardwood like they were meant to leave marks. Her perfume hit the air before her voice did, sharp and cloying. "You hid this from me." No greeting, no build-up, just a shout designed to set the tone. She was still clutching the trust notice, edges crumpled where her fingers had dug in. Her cheeks were flushed, not with the delicate pink of embarrassment, but with the blotchy red of someone whose plan had just gone sideways. I didn't bother standing. I was sitting on the couch with a folder in my lap, papers spread neatly on the coffee table. I looked at her the way you look at an unexpected weather change. Mild curiosity, no alarm. "No," I said evenly. "You never asked." That made her flinch more than I expected. Her mouth opened, ready for the next accusation, but I didn't give her the room to build it. And it wasn't mine until now. Her eyes darted, searching for some crack in my statement, some angle she could attack. She found none. That pale note crept into her skin then, draining away the heat in her face. Her jaw tightened, but the words she wanted wouldn't come out. "You knew." She tried finally, but it landed weak. I reached for the folder in front of me, slid the signed divorce agreement across the table so it stopped inches from her hand. "Still want to proceed?" The silence that followed was long enough to hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the muted traffic outside. She stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves if she waited long enough. She swallowed, slow, deliberate, like it hurt. "This isn't. It's exactly what you wanted." I cut in, my voice as calm as if we were talking about the weather. "You rushed it. You were so eager to finish me off you didn't check the board first." Her grip on the trust notice loosened. The page slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor between us. I didn't look at it. For the first time since this whole charade started, she seemed small. Not physically. She was still standing there in that tailored dress, shoulders squared, but something in the way her eyes shifted told me she'd felt the ground tilt. "You think this changes everything?" she tried, but even she seemed unconvinced by her own voice. I leaned back, resting my hands on the arm of the couch. "It already has." She didn't sit. She didn't touch the divorce agreement. She just stood there for a beat longer, then turned sharply, heels cracking against the floor as she left. When the door closed behind her, I picked up the trust notice from the floor and placed it neatly atop the divorce papers. 2 pieces of paper. One had been her weapon, the other mine. Only one of them still mattered. It was almost midnight when I got the call, not from her, but from someone who'd been in the room. A mutual acquaintance, the kind who likes to see drama unfold from the front row and can't resist feeding details to the other side. "They're at her mother's place," he said. "You're going to want to hear this." I didn't have to prompt him. He launched right into it. Apparently, after leaving my rental in that pale, tight-lipped silence, she'd driven straight to her mother's. No surprise. Her mother was the architect of this whole thing, the voice in her ear from the very beginning. But tonight, the conversation didn't start with smug strategy. It started with her pacing the living room, holding that trust notice like it was evidence in a trial she'd already lost. Her voice was raised, sharp enough to cut through walls. "Why didn't you tell me this could happen?" Her mother, sitting stiffly on the sofa, took a slow sip from her wine glass. "It shouldn't have mattered. We filed fast. He didn't have time to move anything." That's when her lawyer, yes, they'd brought him along for the post-mortem, cleared his throat. "That's the problem," he said. "By filing and signing so quickly, you locked yourselves out of any assets that weren't accessible during the marriage. The trust was one of them." Apparently, the room went still. My acquaintance swore he could feel the temperature drop through the phone. Her mother frowned, not quite understanding. "But we wanted to stop him from hiding assets." "You did," the lawyer interrupted. "Too well. The moment the separation papers were filed, anything tied to that trust became his alone. Legally, there's no claim. None. Even if you delayed a week, it wouldn't have mattered. The trust's terms were airtight." There was a pause, then the sound of her heels on the hardwood as she turned on her mother. "What have you done?" It wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. The kind that rewrites years of loyalty in an instant. She'd followed her mother's advice like scripture, certain it would lead her to a windfall. Instead, it had closed the only door she needed open. Her mother bristled, defensive now. "I was protecting you." "From what?" she snapped. "From winning." The lawyer sat there, hands folded, letting the silence stretch until it was almost painful. He knew there was no undoing it, no clever workaround. The trust had been designed for exactly this scenario, someone on the outside trying to get in. By the time my source hung up, I could picture it clearly. Two women, once perfectly aligned in their plan to bleed me dry, now standing on opposite sides of a crack they'd made themselves. And me? I was sitting in my loft, sipping coffee gone lukewarm, feeling no particular urgency. They'd done my work for me. The most loyal ally she had just became the reason she'd lost everything. Sometimes the cleanest victories don't come from the moves you make. They come from the mistakes your enemies can't help but make on their own. It was exactly 7 days later when the city's business journal hit the stands, and more importantly, every major inbox in town. They'd chosen a photo from the trust banquet that week. Me in a charcoal suit, shaking hands with the chairman of a major investment group, the skyline visible through the ballroom windows. It wasn't staged for drama, but the image had weight. The kind of picture people cut out and tack to bulletin boards and offices they'll never admit they wish they worked in. The headline made it better. "New sole beneficiary of the Caraway Family Trust." Short, sharp, impossible to misinterpret. I didn't have to wonder how quickly she saw it. The Business Journal has a morning newsletter, and I knew she subscribed, had bragged about it when we were still married, like it was her personal pipeline to the movers and shakers. That morning, she would have clicked the email expecting some story about a merger or a luxury development. Instead, she'd have seen my face, my name, and a number she couldn't quite picture in her head without feeling sick. By mid-morning, her phone must have been vibrating itself toward combustion. Old acquaintances, casual friends, even people she hadn't spoken to in years. All of them messaging variations of the same thing. "You walked away from that? What happened? Wasn't this yours too?" The ones who knew better didn't ask. They just sent the link, no caption, letting her sit with it. Word spreads differently when it's printed. Gossip can be denied, twisted, brushed off as out of context. But a headline? A photo? Those are permanent. That morning, the version of the story she'd been telling her circle, about how she came out ahead in the divorce, died in print. I imagine she tried at first to manage it, to answer a few calls, to spin it. Maybe she told one or two people, "Oh, that's just family money. Nothing I'd ever have touched anyway." But it wouldn't hold. People know when you're lying to cover humiliation. It seeps into your voice. By afternoon, she stopped picking up entirely. Friends who used to post pictures with her now tagged each other in comments on the article, little inside jokes that were anything but private. That evening, a mutual contact told me she deleted 3 different social media posts in under an hour, each one a clumsy attempt to reclaim the narrative. It didn't matter. The narrative was no longer hers to tell. The city now had a clean, official version. I had inherited everything. She had nothing. I didn't reach out. I didn't gloat. The point of letting humiliation do its work is to stay silent while it circulates. My name was being spoken in rooms she'd once tried to dominate, and every time it came up, it came with a reminder of what she'd lost, what she'd thrown away believing she could take more. Public image isn't everything, but when someone builds their entire identity on appearing victorious, public loss is a kind of exile. And by the end of that week, she was exactly where I wanted her, isolated, unreachable, and with nothing left to say that anyone wanted to hear. It didn't take her long to make her next move. Humiliation, in her world, was only tolerable if it could be followed by a comeback story, and this time, she thought the courts would write it for her. She called her lawyer the morning after the Business Journal headline dropped, and by that afternoon, a formal petition had been filed to reopen the divorce case. The argument was predictable: concealed wealth. She claimed I had deliberately hidden the existence of the trust, that it should have been considered marital property, that she'd been misled into settling. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation makes people forget just how airtight the walls are around certain fortresses. I didn't even have to lift a finger. The trust's attorneys, people who had been working with my father's estate longer than she'd been an adult, handled it like swatting a fly. The reply landed on her lawyer's desk within hours. Funds were inaccessible until after the legal separation was filed. Under the terms of the Caraway Family Trust, no marital claim exists on assets activated post-separation. Any assertion to the contrary is without legal merit. It was the kind of language that doesn't just close a door, it bricks it over. I wasn't in the room when her lawyer read it aloud to her, but someone who has told me the air seemed to drain out of her. She sat there, perfectly still, as he leaned back in his chair, glasses dangling from one hand. "There's nothing left to do," he said. "Not we could try something else. Not maybe there's an appeal, just that flat, final sentence." And he meant it. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. Her shoulders just slumped. A small, involuntary movement, but one that said more than any tantrum could have. In that moment, she understood, not just that she'd lost, but that the loss was permanent. By her own design, she'd rushed the process, signed away her only leverage, and walked straight past the locked gate that held everything she wanted. Now she was on the wrong side of it, staring at stone and steel with no key in sight. She left his office quietly, and for once, there was no phone call to me afterward. No text, no attempt to claw back some moral high ground. Whatever fight she thought she had was gone. Later that evening, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window in my loft, looking out over the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, and somewhere across town, she was probably sitting in that big house she thought she'd won, realizing it was just walls and furniture now. No trust, no future claim, no story to tell that didn't end with her own mistake. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, no shouting matches, no courtroom drama, just the quiet certainty that the game was over, and she'd been the one to call checkmate on herself. The banquet was held in the same ballroom my father had used for decades. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, a view of the skyline that seemed almost staged. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and expensive wine, the kind of atmosphere where every handshake felt like a transaction and every smile came with calculation behind it. I took my seat at the head table, not out of ego, but because it was my name on the trust now. The evening unfolded with the usual rhythm. Introductions, applause for charitable contributions, murmured conversations about markets and mergers. I nodded where I needed to, shook hands when expected, all the while feeling the weight of the speech card in my jacket pocket. When the chairman introduced me, I rose without ceremony, walking to the podium with the same calm I'd had the night she slid those divorce papers across the table. I could feel 100 sets of eyes on me, some curious, others calculating what my new position meant for them. I didn't read from the card. Instead, I rested my hands lightly on the podium and looked out at the room. True wealth, I began, isn't just what you inherit. It's knowing who should never share it. A ripple went through the room. Not laughter, not applause, just that subtle shift when people realize they've been given a line worth remembering. I let the words hang there, meeting a few gazes, letting each person decide for themselves what I meant. Then I raised my glass, a faint smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. To the future. The toast was met with warm applause, but my mind wasn't on the clinking glasses or the nods of approval. It was elsewhere, across town, in a dimly lit kitchen where I knew she'd be alone. I could picture it clearly. Her in that silk robe she wore when she wanted to feel in control, now rumpled. The house around her silent in a way that felt less like peace and more like absence. A half-empty bottle of wine on the counter, a single glass in front of her. Maybe she'd seen the banquet on social media, a tagged photo of me with the other trustees, or maybe she'd chosen to avoid it entirely, knowing it would sting. But either way, she'd hear my words eventually. The city had a way of repeating things worth repeating. And when she did, they'd land differently than they had for the people in that room. For them, it was a line about prudence and legacy. For her, it would be a mirror, showing her the moment she'd gambled everything on arrogance and lost. The echo of her own words, "I'll drain him dry," would be deafening in that empty kitchen. I didn't need her to see my face or hear my voice in person. The damage was done, the walls were sealed, and the key had been melted down long before she knew she needed it. She hadn't just failed to take what she wanted. She'd built the barrier that kept her out. Back in the ballroom, I returned to my seat, the murmur of conversation resuming around me. Deals were being discussed, futures planned, alliances formed. My glass was refilled, and I took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in. Across the city, she was staring at nothing, wine glass in hand, replaying every choice that had led her to that moment. And the most satisfying part wasn't that I'd beaten her. It was that she'd beaten herself, and there was no undoing it.